His Excellency, the World Bank Group Presidency, V20 President, Honourable Ministers, V20 Secretariat, and representatives of all institutional partners. Eswatini has achieved significant progress in overall socio-economic development, which is visible through economic growth, improvements in health, educational outcomes, greater access to energy, and improvement in water supply, sanitation, and hygiene, what we refer to as WASH, including associated infrastructure. As a developing country with about 58% of the population living below the poverty line, the national determined contribution for Eswatini to the Paris Agreement on climate change emphasizes adaptation measures while at the same time reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 5% unconditionally and 14% conditionally with international support between now and 2030 from the business as usual baseline of 2010. However, there's an urgency to act now. Government is working tirelessly to reduce the effects of climate change and investing in adaptation to help curb the effects of climate change that are felt by the country today. Revenue enhancement reforms are put in place. This strategy includes, amongst other policy changes, the introduction of carbon tax in the year 2025-2026. We've currently also reduced the age of the importation of second-hand vehicles in Eswatini from 15 years to 8 years, which will also have a large impact on carbon emissions in Eswatini from vehicles. Additionally, the cost of adaptation to climate change now can prove to contribute towards the outright avoidance of adverse impacts on climatical hazards and related disasters, which will be much less costly than disaster relief and response. A risk mapping exercise and stakeholder consultations carried out was based on a review of national assessments of five sectors, which were agriculture, water, health, ecosystems and biodiversity, and infrastructure. These were prioritized for adaptation action. Integrating climate change and national disasters and economic analysis project is key. The majority of climate finance funds mobilized between 2015 and 2019 were directed towards agriculture, water, and the energy sectors. It's likely that further support is needed in these areas to address the country's needs. Furthermore, country priorities in sustainable transport, waste management, wetland conservation and restoration, disaster risk reduction and mitigation, and climate-proofed infrastructure have received minimal to no external climate finance to date. Nevertheless, our revised national determined contributions has enhanced and strengthened its prior goals from 2015 by adding additional measures for the infrastructure sector, providing a quantifiable emission reduction target of 14% and included cross-cutting issues of gender, youth, and disaster risk reduction. The finalization and implementation of the National Adaptation Plan and enhancing governance on legal framework in such adaptation contributions across all sectors includes finalization and implementation of the National Adaptation Plan, which we refer to as NAP, and enhancing governance and legal framework through the development of a National Climate Change Bill. Other strategic interventions include, but are not limited to, improving integrated water resource management, improving food and nutritional security, climate-smart agriculture, disaster and risk management, sustainable natural resource management, controlling invasive alien plant species and pollution, agroforestry, strengthening and preparedness of resilience in the health sectors to respond to climate-related emergencies, restoring and protecting wetlands, strengthening climate-informed disease control programs, and surveillance systems using the climate services to target vector control. Financing adaptation and building resilience to climate change will need more resources and will exert pressure on the fiscus. At the same time, not providing for these has negative repercussions as more resources will be needed to respond to issues of climate change in the future. As yet, the public debt stock in the financial year 2022-2023 is estimated to reach 42% of GDP, of which about 52% accounts for domestic debt and 48% of external debt. However, post-COVID-19, there could be a need to look at debt restructuring to benefit the country. Most likely, that debt for climate swaps are to be the focus, restructuring of market-based debt for different economies. Sustainability of financing climate change is also concerning as we encounter more climate change issues in the medium to long term. Eswatini also needs to tag her national budgetary expenditure using climate budget tagging and coding in order to identify financing gaps that can be covered through concerted efforts in climate finance mobilization. We are aware that the country loses billions of emalangeni as a result of climate change. This is a major challenge we are facing as a country, and we have not been able to fully cost our losses. And we believe going forward we will need to work towards that. According to our National Determined Contributions, referred to as NDCs, the cost to implement climate change action for both mitigation and adaptation up to 2030 amounts to about $950 million to about $1.5 billion US. Thus, climate finance is important for our country to achieve its ambitious NDC. Furthermore, with the analysis that's being done on the NDC revision to achieve our NDC contributions in adaptation in agriculture, water, health, ecosystem, biodiversity, and infrastructure, it will cost the country a sum of $350.8 million US. The cost for mitigation, covering energy efficiency, electricity energy generation, waste sector, agriculture, forestry, and industrial processing and product use, stands at $446.4 million US. This figure may have increased with the prolonged impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the global food crisis associated with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Under the prevailing situation, the medium-term expenditure framework, what referred to as the MTFF, is going to be overstretched as the country is already faced with challenges on the fiscus due to socio-economic pressures. With possible financing instruments to access climate finance, the country can benefit and have relief on the prevailing expenditure pressures. The adaptation and mitigation measures do need a financing mechanism that is sustainable to ensure that climate change issues are fully addressed. Eswatini is grateful for our development partners who support mobilization of climate finance, including the NDC Partnership, UNDP, the EU, the Commonwealth, and the FAO, amongst many others. The climate finance landscape covers external sources of climate finance provided during the period of 2015 to 2019. It provides also a mapping of future potential sources of climate finance to address country priorities and assesses institutional arrangements and capacities to mobilize domestic and external climate finance. During the period of 2015 to 2019, Eswatini received approximately $209 million US from international financiers for 30 projects during the period of implementation. For the first NDC, which was from 2015 to 2019, approximately $103 million US was leveraged as co-finance, mainly from domestic sources. The total climate finance mobilized in 2015 to 2019 period was thus approximately $212 million US. The external funding for climate action received in Eswatini has been executed by key government agencies in the sectors affected by climate change. The external funding has been mobilized more through grants than through loans. Grant funding amounted to $125 million US, and loan funding amounted to $94 million US. In terms of the number of projects, 22 projects received grant funding, 6 projects received loan funding, and two projects received a blend of loan and grants. Information on private sector climate finance in Eswatini is not well documented. Several private sector entities have been engaged in the development of the Green Climate Fund country program for Eswatini under the GCF Readiness Support Project. Adaptation is clearly the priority in the country in terms of both amounts mobilized and the number of projects. Adaptation funding in this period in Eswatini is greater than mitigation funding, $254 million versus $5.5 million respectively. Funding for cross-cutting projects amounted to about $0.8 million, focusing on the creation of an enabling environment. Out of the 30 projects, 19 focused on adaptation, which was in the fields of water, agriculture, and biodiversity sectors, 5 on mitigation, mainly in the energy sectors, and 6 were cross-cutting. From the 3 projects currently awaiting approval, 1 is focusing on mitigation, which is $900,000. 1 is cross-cutting, which is costing $2.4 million, and 1 on adaptation, which is $37 million. At national level, several barriers have prevented Eswatini from adequately building its technical and institutional capacity to adequately address climate change. Inadequate institutional and human capacity in the face of evolving international regulations and requirements, combined with increasing levels of climate-induced disasters and threats domestically, have maintained constant pressure on the government to strengthen its national institutional capacity. Eswatini has limited capacity to track and coordinate climate finance and to budget for climate change adaptation stemming from a lack of comprehensive climate finance monitoring, reporting, and verification. Part of the recommendations of the recently conducted Government of Eswatini Climate Public Expenditure and Institutional Review, supported by the Commonwealth Secretariat, was to set up a system for climate budget tagging, which we refer to as CBT, and develop a climate finance monitoring, reporting, and verification tool. Eswatini would require financial and technical support to undertake these recommendations. This would support the country in its quest to scale up climate finance mobilization for its climate action. The Kingdom of Eswatini has not yet requested for the Resilience and Sustainability Facility, but is considering making the request for the facility before the end of the year. There is a need to consider the resilience of infrastructure at all levels. It's imperative to provide funding and improve decision-making. The country may also benefit from the resilient rating system and climate risk stress testing to improve tracking and assistance from the funders. I thank you all very much.